subsequently completed his MA and PhD from Calcutta University. He started his teaching career in Ashutosh College, Kolkata, and was also associated with PG teaching in the Department of Economics of Calcutta University and other reputed institutes of the country. Later, he joined Vishwabharati University as a professor of economics. He has been a very popular and an unconventional teacher too. Professor Basu has been a scholar of high repute. His articles have been published in distinguished academic journals in both Bengali and English languages. He has also got a number of chapters and books in his enviable publication list. His active area of interest and research has been political economy. His students, including myself, had been fortunate enough to learn mainstream economics and its possible socio-political angle simultaneously. He has been always keen to understand the society and its order and has taken deep interest in extending his academic understanding to explore new dimensions in practical applications. Today, we expect to get a glimpse of his intellectual and thought-provoking prowess. We of course believe that Professor Basu's interpretation of Marxian thought,
discussing Marx group, we will be able to engage in lectures delivered by some of us and maybe some guests, in which we will be able to apply these ideas to understanding the reality. Now, when we discuss any person, in fact, it doesn't have to be a thinker. Every person is a product of his or her times. Now, product of the times in what sense? The times in two senses. One is the personal times and the other is the social time. The personal history and the society at that point of time, and they are both interacting with one another. Now, Marx was writing between 1843 and 1883, and of course, we know that posthumously a lot has been published. In fact, the volume 3 of Capital was published much later in 1894. But we can say that since the middle of the 1840s to 1890s, 1883, Marx is writing, and this is the period we are talking about. Now, what was the specifics of this period? This period was immediately succeeding the Industrial Revolution. Now, so to understand the thought of Marx, we'll start with trying to understand the economics of that period, the society of that period, the culture of that period. Now, Lenin, of course, and when we talk about the personal history, we must understand that Marx, of course, had a disciplinary training in philosophy and law, and he had a deep interest in political economy. But beyond that, and this is important, Marx was very much involved in the workers' movements. He was one of the founders of and German philosophy. Now, he does not at all mention his activism. Now, soon afterwards, Lenin was to himself say that he was writing only about these theoretical aspects because he wanted to contradict a certain idea that was going within the workers' movement, that one didn't have to delve into theory, one didn't have to think about theory. Practice, just the experience, everyday experience was sufficient. To counter that, Lenin talked about these three intellectual sources of Marx. But he also said that in the process, he, as Althusser put it, he bent the stick too much backwards. That is, he didn't at all talk about his activism, which was a very important thing, and we'll come back to this when we come to his particular theories. Now, the Industrial Revolution, of course, that as the term says, it's to do with industry, but the Industrial Revolution could occur only because it had been preceded the Industrial Revolution, the field was left barren in order to restore its fertility through a three-field system where one-third of the field was left barren, and the other and leguminous plants were used to restore fertility, etc. So there was a huge increase in productivity and production in agriculture. Together with this, of course, there was a change in the cropping, in the production pattern. From producing crops, there was a tendency to rear sheep for wool exports, particularly, and this, all this, both the increase in productivity, impetus to the Industrial Revolution. Now, the migration to the towns, we can the reasons we can divide into two sets. One we can call the push factors, and the other the pull factors. That is, the factors which impelled, which repelled the peasants from the villages to the towns, and the other which attracted the villagers, the peasants, to the towns. Now, among the push factors, there was, of course, the redundancy of peasants, which we have just talked about, the increase in productivity, the change in cropping. All this made some peasants redundant. But apart from the redundancy, there was a very important reason why peasants could no longer survive in their great numbers in the villages. This was what is called the enclosure movement. Now, the enclosure movement was a set of legal and extra-legal. Some were approved by the state and some were not at all approved by the state. Legal and extra-legal measures for enclosing the commons. Now, what were the commons? The commons were territories within the villages to which all the villagers were allowed access. Now, what made up these commons? There were the pastures, there were the water bodies, and there were the forests. Now, all the peasants had access to all these commons. Now, through the enclosure movement, the lords, the manorial lords, they enclosed the commons and made it their private property. That is, excluded the peasants, excluded the serfs from the use of these commons. Now, what was the impact of this? Why did this act as a push factor, pushing the peasants away from the villages to the towns? This became a push factor for two reasons. First, the enclosure of the pastures, it prevented the peasants from rearing the horses. So at that time, the major source of power for agricultural activity was horsepower, and the horses could not be reared by the peasants because the pastures were no longer available to them. Besides this, the enclosure of the forests, what it led to was that the peasants no longer could supplement whatever they could grow on their own lands with the venison, that is the meat of the deer, or the fruits from the forest, etc. They could not supplement their diets with this, and these supplements were necessary for their survival. Now, many of you may have read the story of Robin Hood and his band of merry men who were operating in the Sherwood forest. Now, Robin Hood is considered a kind of social bandit because who was rebelling against this enclosure, because the forests were previously open to them, and now the Earl of Sherwood had enclosed the forest, denied access to it, and then these bandits, they were violating this, they were rebelling against, protesting against this enclosure and accessing the food from the forest, and that is how this story was born. Now, apart from these two, there was also substitution of, we had talked about this increase in productivity and substitution of crops with sheep rearing. Now, what was the pull factor? The pull factor was also very significant. You see, at that time, the system, the political system that prevailed was what we call feudalism. Feudalism, in the feudal system, surplus is extracted on the basis of some privileges which are granted to the manorial lord, like we had the Jomidars in our country. They are granted privileges by the monarch. They are entitled to a certain territory and they extract rent from that on the basis of their privilege. It is quite unlike the modern system where you see the Ambanis and the Adanis and the Birlas and Tatas, they are not privileged in the constitution. The constitution doesn't mention them. They are all citizens just like you and me. But of course, we know that they enjoy some extra legal powers. That's besides the point. But constitutionally, they are not. There is no privilege. We are all equal in the eyes of the law and in terms of being able to exercise our franchise. So now, within the feudal system, there was a system of privileges. There was a hierarchy. There was the king on top. Then there were barons and knights. And at the bottom of the feudal hierarchy aristocracy, there was a manorial lord. And below that, there were the peasants. The peasants who were bondsmen. They were bonded to the earth. They were not allowed. They were punished if they tried to go from one manor to another. Now, these bondsmen, there were various shades of bondages, of course, but they wanted freedom, and the freedom was afforded by the towns. If they could flee to the towns, then they would be free. Why? Because the towns were actually administered in a more democratic way. It was run by corporations, by town councils, which were elected from amongst the merchants. The merchants actually, they got the right to build a town from the feudal lords, and the people who ran the towns were elected from among the merchant guilds. Election was, of course, it was not. There were different kinds. We do not go into the details of that, but they were. It was not a privileged society. If you went to the towns, the only privilege was the privilege of having more or less money. Now, so the villagers, they migrated from the towns, from the villages to the towns because of both the push and the pull factors. Now, this was the agrarian revolution, and the result of that, as far as the industry is concerned, was that a lot of peasants were migrating to the towns. Now, what was happening to the industry? Now, during the heyday of the feudal period, industries were artisan, petty production based, that is like our cottage industries, not khadi cottage industries, where the artisans owned their own tools and they produced with their own or their family labor. They resided in the villages, and the village itself provided the markets for the blacksmith, the potter, the weaver, etc. So it was a localized market, a small market, and you had small scale production where the artisans produce with their own tools and with their own or family labor. Now, why was there no large scale production? You see, the answer lies in the politics of the feudal system. As we had said, the feudal system is based on privileges. Now, so the manorial lord, the privileged segments, they had to show to the underprivileged, the serfs, the bondsmen, the peasants, free peasants even, that we are superior to you. Now, how are we superior? Our culture is superior. We talk a different kind of language. We treat our women folk differently, and we are more valorous. We are brave. We can fight. We have physical strength. Now, in order to show all this, the Lord had to be present. He had to be visible to the serfs, to the peasants, so that they could appreciate and they could say that yes, just like the Jamidar, was to show his, the riots would argue amongst themselves whether my Jomidar is better than your Jomidar, and they would have to prove their superiority in terms of their benevolence, their philanthropy, etc., etc. Now, similarly, the Western manorial law had to be present and prove one's superiority over those over whom you rule. Now, so this local presence was important, and therefore the economy also had to be insular. Like you see today, of course, now today we have a prime minister who really is different, who boasts about his 56 inches and who clothes himself in a way which is very distinctive. But look back and think of, say, Manmohan Singh or even Lal Bahadur Shastri. Most of you will not be able to recollect. Now, they were prime ministers, and one respected them for that, and they did not have to. They were not different from us. Their voices, they didn't have great voices or did not have valor. They were not valorous because this system is not based on privileges. But the feudal system was based on privileges, and the feudal lord had to show his difference, his superiority, and so had to be visible. And in order to be that, he had to stop, he had to be insular, the economy had to be insular. And that is why the production, the industrial production was on a small scale, it was artisan based. Now, once the villages started fleeing to the towns for the reasons that we have argued. Now, you see, those who were fleeing were peasants, but the blacksmith or the weaver or the potter, now these were not always full-time occupations. They were doing, just like in our country, you have weavers, cottage weavers, who are also doing agricultural activities. So when those who were fleeing to the towns were also artisans. Now, when they fled to the towns, these artisans, they of course got their freedom, but they were economically stifled by the merchants. The reason was the merchants were united in their guilds, that is kind of association. Now the craftsmen also they also had their guilds, they made their own guilds, but these guilds were less powerful than the merchant guilds. One reason, of course, was that the craft guilds had a hierarchy within it, and there was friction within the craft guild. There was, on top there was the master craftsman, below there was what was called the journeyman, and at the bottom there were the apprentices. After a few years as an apprentice, you could become a journeyman. You got a diploma, you became a journeyman. Now a journeyman could produce on one's own but could not employ others. And then later you could become a master craftsman if the guild gave you that certificate. Now this was meant, the craft guilds were meant to ensure one quality and also to ensure that there was little competition, that the master craftsmen they decided amongst themselves how many they would allow to become journeymen, how many they would allow to become master craftsmen. So they kept it restricted in order to restrict competition amongst themselves. But they were less powerful than the merchant guilds because of the internal friction, one, and secondly, they had to rely on the merchants to reach their consumers, the ultimate consumers. They had to reach through the merchant guilds. So as a result, the merchant guilds had a kind of monopoly over the markets, and they ultimately, the craftsmen were getting economically poorer, while the merchants were getting economically richer. As a result, at one point of time, the craftsmen started, they did not have the capital to buy the inputs required, the yarn for weaving, the iron for the ironsmiths, blacksmiths. So they started relying on the merchant for the supply of the inputs, and also on the merchants for giving them orders. So they were producing to the orders given by the merchants and working on raw materials provided by the merchants. And in this way, they were transformed from independent petty producers to dependent petty producers, from independent artisans to dependent artisans. They were depending now on the orders of the merchants. They could not produce whatever they wanted. They, according to the orders, the kind of things that the merchants wanted, they had to produce. Now, subsequently, this trend of increasing wealth in the hands of the merchants and decreasing wealth in the hands of the artisans, this continued to the point where the artisans could no longer afford to own their own tools. They sold their tools, their looms, the potter's wheel, etc. These were sold to whom? Mainly to the merchants, but also to some master craftsmen. These master craftsmen had acquired wealth by using their monopoly power, but in some trades, by restricting the number of master craftsmen, and the journeymen or the other smaller master craftsmen, they sold their tools, they sold their little machines, and these were gathered together under one shed. You had 10, say, looms in sheds which were called manufactories. Now, this transition, then we had first the petty producers, the independent petty producers, then we had the dependent petty producers, and now we have the workers. You see, this was the beginning of the capitalist system about which Marx was to write so much. This was called by Marx in volume 1 of Capital, when he talks of primitive accumulation, he calls this formal subsumption under capital. That is, now these artisans were now formally, they were legally under the control of the capitalists, those who owned the tools of production. Now, these workmen, what could they sell? They could not sell their wares because now they didn't own the tools, they didn't own the inputs, nothing. So what could they sell? They could sell the only input that that they possess, which Marx calls the inalienable means of production, that is the power to labor. You see, the power to labor is something which cannot be taken away from any person. If you take the power to labor away from a person, the person simply dies. So this was something, all other things they had lost in the process of their impoverishment. So they sold this power to the people who, the capitalists who owned the means of production, who supplied the raw materials. They sold their labor power against wages. So this was called formal subsumption. Legally, they were now under the control of the capitalists. This is called formal subsumption in the sense that there was no change in the technology. So the knowledge of how the loom worked, of how the potter's wheel worked, this knowledge was still vested in the artisans. They were the people who knew how it worked, how to repair the machinery, etc., etc. So the capitalists did not have the knowledge. So the control was simply in terms of legal. This was why Marx calls it the formal subsumption under capital. And so you had to be very strictly supervised to see that you were not wasting your time, because there was no other way in which you could control. Now, from this, there was a transition. The next transition was what we call the transition to real subsumption under capital, and this occurred through the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, which we can date roughly, some say 1750, well, it occurred in the 18th century and it was probably completed by somewhere around the 1770s. Now, what did the Industrial Revolution involve? It involved two things. One, it involved a change in the organization of production, and two, it involved the introduction of machinery, and of course the steam power was also introduced during this period. These are the two things it involved. What do I mean when I say that it involved a change in the organization of production? What we mean is that now we had the industrial division of labor, about which Adam Smith talks a lot. The example that he gives is of the pin manufacturing industry, where previously each artisan used to uh, used to complete all the processes involved in the manufacture of a pin. Now, Smith says that there were 19 processes involved, parts of the production process involved in the production of the pin. Now, with division of labor, industrial division of labor, these 19 processes were divided and allocated to different segments, different groups of laborers. So someone was cutting the wire, someone was straightening the wire, someone was polishing the wire, someone was making the head of the pin, someone fixing it on, and so on. So these 19 component parts of the production process were divided and allocated to different groups of laborers. This is what is called the industrial division of labor. Now, what happens as a result of this industrial division of labor? First of all the workers do not have to be very skilled. Smith says that the most skilled work was that of the person who polished the head of the pin. Now there was only one group doing that. The rest could be less skilled, and the one who was cutting the wire probably was the least skilled. Now, so you could use unskilled workers. As a result, you started employing women who were new to the workforce, women and also children. And then they were paid lower wages. The logic was that they were not running a family. The family was being run by the male. It was, of course, a very male chauvinist kind of society, as all feudal societies are. In fact, our society very much is. Now, so they were not running their family, so this was the logic. So they were being paid less. So as a result of this, the average wage could be brought down. This was one reason for the industrial division of labor. The other reason, of course, was that if you divided up the work, then some people who were cutting the wire would not know how to make the pinhead. Those who made the pinhead wouldn't know how to cut the wire, and so on. So what happened was that the knowledge was no longer vested in the artisan. So control was not merely formal in the sense that you sold the labor power and worked according to the dictates of the capitalist. Control was now built into the production process. But apart from this industrial division of labor, of course, through this period, there were certain machineries which were introduced. Steam power, the first water-powered silk mill was started working in 1721. Then the first commercially successful steam engine started working in 1761. And of course, we know James Watt in 1765. He increased tremendously the efficiency of the steam engine. And then there was Arkwright, who used a water frame. The force of the water would run the spinning frame. So all these innovations and inventions they were being built into machines, and both the division of labor, industrial division of labor, and the introduction of machinery led to large-scale production. Now, why did the industrial division of labor lead to large-scale? How is it tied to a large scale of production? You see, take the example which Smith talks about. There are 19 component parts to the production process. So if you break them up, you need to employ at least 19 people. Whereas if one person was doing the entire work, then someone could run a small manufactory with 2 or 3 people who were each doing all the different processes involved in the manufacture of the pin. But now you had to employ at least 19 people. Now, what this implied was that the scale of production would increase. And of course, machinery, and particularly the introduction of steam power, this meant that the rate of production increased tremendously. And to keep the machinery employed, you had to increase the scale of production. So now we had the division of labor, the use of machinery, large-scale machinery, and real subsumption under capital. That is, later on, of course, this was what was called, this gave birth to what was called Taylorism. That is, now the production process became so complicated that the artisans who now had been converted to the workers, their next generations have become workers in the factories. Now from the manufactory, we had the factory now. In these factories, the single worker had little knowledge of the entire production process. Now, this is a favorite example which I have given to so many students. Probably a lot of you have seen Modern Times and seen how Charlie Chaplin becomes an extension of the machine, and when he leaves the factory, also he's tightening, he's going about with his spanner, tightening the button on the tunic of a woman. And so you see, this is what is happening. There is an alienation. This becomes important when we come to Marx. There is an alienation which is involved, which is correlated with the control passing from the workers to the capitalists. The industrial engineers, who are the representatives of the capitalists, they are now planning the production and the workers are simply executing. Now, Engels says very vividly that what is the difference between human labor and animal labor? The difference is this, that a human being performs a labor twice, once in the mind and then in action. So you plan and you execute your plan, and that is why you have satisfaction in your labor. You realize your life in your labor. What you are doing if you're planning, like I was saying, that previously I was constrained by the syllabus, by the institutional requirements, and now I'm unconstrained. I have been able to plan this course according to my likes. So now that I'm delivering this lecture, this is a joyful experience to me. So it was for the artisans who were planning and executing their plans. But now, with the birth of the factory system, these workers were no longer planning. They were alienated. They lost their interest in the work. They were alienated from the work. Once you enter the factory, as Marx says, you have liberty and equality outside the factory gates, because capitalism broke down the feudal bondage. As we were saying, the towns were more free. You have freedom outside, but within the factory you have the master-slave relation, because you are compelled to follow the dictates. And that is why the workers rebel in various ways. They break machines. We'll talk about these various kinds of movements. And we say the workers are lazy. That is something which is very commonly said, that workers are lazy, and also leftist unions are also blamed for making workers lazy. And you see, the point is that the workers, why should they be interested in working efficiently? See, they are working for some, once you enter the factory, you have sold your labor power for 8 hours or 10 hours in the day. That is someone else's property. I have no control over that. So that is not my lifetime. That is my labor time, which I've sold someone else. So the worker is not concerned about making good use of that. Would rather convert the labor time into lifetime. So this was the birth of the subsumption under capital to real subsumption under capitalism, and we had the full-fledged capitalist system. Now, together with these changes in the economy, which was of course reflected in Marx's writings and influenced him greatly, there were a lot of changes taking place in the social and cultural spheres. First of all, as we have mentioned, urbanization, it abolished the feudal bondages. Individual liberties increased, and we had the birth of what is called liberalism. That is the idea that individuals, free individuals, are make the society, and the greater the freedom given to individuals, the better off will be the society. Now, there was a lot of changes also in the religion, the church. You see, from the Roman Catholic Church, which is very rigid in its dictates, and it was very had a lot of pomp and ceremonial expenditures, these were protested, and you had the what is called the Protestant sects, new churches which no longer mm, uh, professed allegiance to the Roman Catholic Pope. So there were changes in the church, and these were they were challenging the authority of the priest and the Pope. Together with this, there were the changes in the philosophy, in science, and instead of going into all the details of it, what we'll do is we'll mention a few names which will act as a shorthand to capture the changes. First of all, there was Bentham. From 17, his span was 1748 to 1832. He was what is called a utilitarian. He believed that people are egoistic, coldly calculating, inert, and atomistic. Egoistic, coldly calculating, inert, and atomistic. What does egoistic means? That is, people were guided by their own feeling of pleasure and pain. That is, they were, I want to do something, I would calculate what is the pleasure I get from it, what is the pain that I would get from it. So, on the basis of this, I would take my decisions. They were calculating, they were coldly calculating. This is related to this egoism. That is, you weigh what is the pleasure I get, what is the pain I get. It is like nowadays you have this theories of punishment, risk theories, where you're told that people who are thinking of doing a criminal activity, they calculate, depending on the kind of punishment that is awarded, what is the risk, and together with it, what kind of punishment I'll get, and if I escape, then what will be the uh, pleasure I get out of it. So what will be the gain? So you have a probabilistic calculation, and based on that, you decide whether you commit a crime or not. So this is what basically Bentham was saying, that whether I will do this or that, whether I'll do this act, will depend on what do I think will be the pleasure I derive from this, and what do I think will be the pain that I get as a result of uh, indulging in this activity. So people were egoistic, they were coldly calculating, and they are inert. That is, unless I feel that from doing something I will get a pleasure, and I will have or I will get pain, or I will get both, and then I count, then I weigh the two. Unless I get a pleasure or pain or both, I will not be moved doing anything. So in that sense, Bentham is saying that people are inert, and society is atomistic. It is previously it was believed that the social order is derived from from God, from some supernatural sources. That is, during the feudal period, for example, the king was anointed by the bishop or the pope himself. So there was this. So the power was derived from God, and it was bestowed on the king through his earthly representatives. Now, what Bentham is saying is that society is atomistic. No one binds a society together. It is only the individuals together, the sum total of these free individuals who make up society. Now, with Bentham, we have another before Bentham, in fact, we have a very important figure called Descartes. Descartes, his period was 1596 to 1650. He gave birth to what is known as skepticism. That is, you doubt everything. He places reason, your own ability, individual's own ability to think, to reason, at the center of philosophy. And skepticism, you doubt everything. You don't accept what the Pope says, you don't accept what your priest says, you don't accept what the Lord says. You doubt everything. And he takes doubt to this level that he makes this famous statement that I think and so I am. So uh, I doubt everything else. Whether now Newton invented the idea of forces and the law of relating the forces, And uh, these laws and the forces, they constituted all physical systems, including the universe. So this reduced the significance of supernatural forces. Everything was explained by the physics of forces and their relations with one another. So there were the changes in the economy preceding Marx, very significant change in agriculture, and peasants were migrating to, there was increase in production and productivity, peasants were migrating to the towns, and there was the changes in the industrial sector from petty production, independent petty production, to dependent petty production, to manufactory, to factory. That is the large scale factory system. And together with this, the growth of the towns itself, this inspired the idea of freedom, liberalism, and you had skepticism, liberalism, utilitarianism, and of course the development of the sciences, and together with it, changes in the church. So this was a period during which all kinds of changes were taking, and basically the idea that there is a society, hierarchical society, which is decided by God, this was breaking up because of economic reasons, because of religious reasons, because of reasons of science, reasons provided by science and philosophy. Now, this period, now for this, up to this, I have prepared the references, so I'm putting up. So I'm sharing the. Now, can you, Dipro, can you see the references? Yeah, so these are the references. If you want, you can take them down, or they will be there on the YouTube. So these are the references for what I've been discussing so far, the changes in the economy, in religion, in society, that accompanied the right up to the Industrial Revolution. And we are arguing that Marx was a product of these social times as well as of his own personal times, which is captured in his involvement with the workers' movements, and also his personal interests in philosophy, in law, and also in political economy. So I think we can move on. Yes. So have you taken down the references? I can now, then I can, we can move on. Oh, okay. So have I stopped sharing? Wipro? Okay. So now, what did this industrial revolution imply for the population at large? Now, the industrial revolution brought a period of sustained growth, though it was uneven before 1760. After 1760, the industrial revolution, particularly the cotton industrial revolution, the cotton sector, cotton industry, this brought on a sustained and a growth which was not equal by growth in any previous period. And then from 1820s, we had what is called the second industrial revolution, coal, iron, steel, etc. Now, the cotton textile revolution occurred in Britain because, of course, it had its empire. First of all, the raw materials were provided by slave plantations in its colonies. The markets were provided largely by its colonies again, and we know from our own colonial history that the markets were, the Indian textiles markets were destroyed. The domestic production was destroyed in order to accommodate, to build a market for British, particularly the students of economics learn in their classes comparative advantage in industry, but simply because it was the reigning imperial power. Its imperial power was not challenged by anybody. There were small imperial powers, also the Dutch, the French, etc. But Britain was the leading imperial country, and that is why the Industrial Revolution came first to Britain. And that is also the reason why political economy developed in Britain. Now, apart from the empire which ensured the supply of raw materials and the market for the industrial products, there was also a domestic market, particularly in the second industrial revolution in the 19th century. This was based largely on the domestic market, the coal industry, for because now these urban centers were growing, the cities were growing. Previously, people were living in the villages, and you could heat your hearth, you could heat your uh, home by using firewood. But now, once you had migrated to the towns, during the winters, these were cold climes, and you had to get the heat in winter, and so you had to rely on coal. So the domestic markets, they fired the second industrial revolution, and together with this, the growth of the towns, there was also a steady growth of what is called the middle classes, lawyers, small capitalists, what we call the petty bourgeois, then medical practitioners. All these were growing. This was the middle class which was growing in numbers. And also, of course, this growth of the towns and liberties, it caused cultural changes which we have talked about: individualism, atomism, and the scientific temper. Now, all these generated a sustained faith in the growth potential of England in the minds of these middle classes. You see, these middle classes who were prospering as a result of this growth, they felt that this growth was a never ending process. And this is what sustained the birth of classical political economy, which is epitomized in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Now, Adam Smith is hailed by the liberals for one particular reason. You see, liberalism has a contradiction within it, has a paradox. On the one hand, liberalism says that individuals should be free. They should be free to do what they please. But if everyone does what one wishes, then there would be chaos. There would be killing. There would be no social order. So then you say that, then you have political scientists like Hobbes and Locke, etc., who say that, well, this kind of liberty, this has to be constrained, and it has to be constrained by the state. So the state becomes a necessary evil. It is evil because it constrains our freedom, but it is necessary because in order to be free, we need to ensure that others do not impinge on my freedom. Others do not, they do not kill me. They do not take my property, etc., etc. So the state has to be there. The state is a necessary evil. So this is a paradoxical system where you required the state to curtail your freedom, and you wanted freedom also. Now the liberals say that Adam Smith solved this problem in what just their own individual likes and dislikes on the basis of their own individual desire to maximize their own utilities. their individual actions are coordinated through the market, the invisible hand of the market, he says, and this leads to the maximum good for the maximum number of people. So here he is apparently solving the paradox that individuals I do not have to think of what is desired by others or whether I'm harming the others. I simply take my decisions on the basis of the market information that I have, and based on my desire to maximize my satisfaction. And so does everyone else. And it is the invisible hand of the market which coordinates all these things, matches demand with supply, and then we have a situation where the maximum good is obtained for the maximum number of people. So Smith is argued to epitomize liberalism, to give a theoretical basis for liberalism. Now, uh, so Smith is apparently working with the sense of egoistic individuals, etc. Now, of course, if one reads Smith, one finds that this is not a proper reading of Smith. He is concerned with human nature. He talks of what is called the impartial observer. I am concerned about how others think about me. So my decisions are constrained by what I think is an impartial observer who is watching me, which is basically others. So I'm thinking of what others are thinking about me. So this is quite different from what the mainstream presentation of Smith. Uh, and apart from this, and Smith talks of benevolence, of which causes harmony in society. So Smith is not really the way he's presented by the liberals, but as a counterpoint to Marx, the mainstream presents Smith as one who's only talking of individuals maximizing their own selfish interests and the invisible hand of the market coordinating all this. Now, recent interpretations of Smith, of course, they have pointed out that Smith does not solve the liberal paradox of individuals wanting to their own good and then conflicting with one another, so you need the state. Smith doesn't solve this problem. What he says, what the modern interpretations say, which is basically based on Foucault, that Smith really displaces this conflict between the state and state's control and individual liberties. It displaces it to various other areas, like the conflict between private and public. How far should an individual be allowed to take own decisions, and how far should be the space of public sphere where the state can intervene? Smith really displaces the conflict between the state and the individual liberties to the conflict between private space and public space, private property and commons. This is something which we talked of the enclosure of commons. We are then talking of commons in a physical sense, in a geographical sense, a territorial sense. But of course, there are other commons which are constantly being enclosed even today. Consider, for example, the World Trade Organization and the patent laws. What did it really do in the late 90s of the previous century? Knowledge commons are enclosed through patent laws. So, in order to be marketable, whatever is newly produced has to be specified as a private commodity. You have to make it a private commodity. In fact, genetic engineering. Now, what is the basis of the genetic engineering? Genetic engineering really is, in order to, nature is nobody's property. Nature propagates itself. But once you have genetic engineering, once you have the genetically modified seeds, then it becomes the property of the seed manufacturer. So this is also a way in which you enclose newer and newer fields. So you are basically shifting the liberal paradox, the conflict between the individual liberties and the state, to different other areas. But Smith is also, apart from this idea of the invisible hand, Smith also had a very serious contribution to make in the field of price determination. He was the first person who stated that prices are determined by the labor embodied. And I quote, in the early and rude state of society where accumulation of stock and appropriation of land had not taken place, close quote, value of a commodity is determined by the labor spent directly or indirectly in its production, and this is entirely received by the producer. So he's by the people who are laboring. So here he is talking where accumulation of stock has not taken place. So capitalism has not come. This is basically what he means. So here you had artisan production. So the artisan is producing with one's own labor, and indirect labor, that is the labor for producing yarn, that is built into the value of the cloth. And this entire labor, this labor embodied, that determines what is called the natural price or the equilibrium price. Now, but Smith qualifies that in the early and rude state. Now, why does he say this? Now, if Smith maintained that labor embodied determines prices in the capitalist society, then what problem would he have? You see, he's saying that the people who are laboring, they are paid their entire the price of their labor, and and this determines the price. This cost determines the price. Now, if that was true in the capitalist society, then how would you explain profit? How would you explain rent? So Smith had this problem. So he said that it's only in the early and root state where practical accumulation not taken place. Then what happens in a capitalist state? He then abandons the labor embodied theory and says that prices are determined by labor command rate, how much labor you can buy. So this no longer remains a theory of the component of price, but it becomes a measure of price, how much labor you can buy. Now, Smith makes many other contributions in the field of economics, some of which were carried over, are borrowed by Marx also. He differentiates between productive and unproductive labor. He says that those labor which produces surplus, they are productive and the others are unproductive. So this is a difference which Marx carries over, we'll see later on. And also he talks about natural price. He differentiates this from the current or the market price. So you have market price, which current price which fluctuates, and you have a natural price or equilibrium price. This again is a difference which is taken over by Marx and which is also used in modern neoclassical economics, which is an extension of classical economics, of course. Now, Marx, before we come to Marx specifically, what did Marx say about Smith? First of all, Marx hailed Smith. Why does he hail Smith? He has a lot of very uncharitable words about Ricardo, whom we are not discussing. But he hails Smith. Why? Because he says that he was the first person who understood that prices are not proportional to labor embodied, though they are determined by labor embodied, they are not proportional to labor embodied in a capitalist society. But he says that why he said this, we will see this when we come to Marx's value theory. Why prices are not proportional to labor embodied, though they are determined by labor embodied, according to Marx. But apart from this, Marx says that Smith made a very great blunder. What was this blunder? I am quoting from Marx Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 19. They never discovered that the course of the analysis had led not only from the market prices of labor to its presumed value, but had led to the resolution of this value of labor itself into the value of labor power. So what he's saying is that Smith's blunder is that he's talking of the value of labor being equal to prices. Whereas when he's saying that prices are not proportional to labor embodied in a capitalist society, he has already discovered that prices. Why is it not so? Because of the idea, because labor power has been born. It was not previously there. Previously, there was the concept of labor. Now it is labor power. Now, what is the difference? Now, what Marx is saying, we will see in detail later on, is that all commodities sell according to their values. That is, according to the labor embodied in them. Now, what is the laborer selling to the capitalist? He's saying labor power, the power to labor for 10 hours. So I'm working in a factory and the contract is work for 10 hours, say, and for 10 hours labor power that I'm selling, I get some commodities or I get some money. Now that money, why it is subsistence. Subsistence in what sense? It keeps the laborer alive for a day, so that the laborer can provide those 10 hours of labor. The laborer is sustained to live for a day so that he can provide those 10 hours of work. So to live for a day, he needs certain commodities, and to buy those commodities, he needs food, he or she needs food, clothes, a shelter, and so on. Now, to manufacture these things, subsistence that the laborer needs, again, labor power is spent. And that is the value of the labor power that I am selling. So it is like this, that I am working 10 hours in the factory. In order to work for 10 hours in the day, I have to be sustained for the day. And in order to sustain the laborer for a day, needs a basket of commodities. Those basket of commodities, that basket of commodities is produced with a certain amount of labor. Say that is 6 hours. So one is working for 10 hours in the factory, getting subsistence for a day, which is produced by 6 hours of labor. So that is the surplus. I am working for 10 hours and getting 6 hours of labor in compensation. So a surplus value of 4 hours is produced, and this becomes a source of profit and rent. So Marx is saying that Smith had made the discovery that labor embodied is not proportional to prices, but then he failed to realize why this is so. The reason, of course, is that one is not selling labor. If one is selling labor, then of course one would get wages equal to the prices. One is saying labor power, and the labor power is just like any other commodity, and like every other commodity, it gets paid according to the labor embodied in that. And what is the labor embodied in 10 hours of work? Labor embodied is the labor spent in producing the subsistence goods for a day, which is 6 hours. So you get 4 hours of surplus value. Now, so Marx is, on the one hand, he's upholding Smith for one, talking about the labor theory of value, two, saying that labor embodied is not proportional to prices, but his great blunder was that he did not discover the concept of labor power, and he was working with the concept of labor instead of labor power. Now, this is where the classical political economy, the optimism, the economy was growing at a very fast rate. Some people were getting the gains of that, and that bred optimism. This optimism led to in social theory to liberalism, and in economics it led to classical political economy, which is epitomized in Smith, who thinks that, well, there will be an unending process of growth. If you let the market free, you will give freedom to the market, there will be an unending process of growth. But was the Industrial Revolution really so beneficial to all the population? Actually, while some prospered and optimism was born from that, the vast majority of the population, they suffered. The vast majority consisting of the working class, the paupers and the unemployed. The paupers meaning those who had lost their property. You see, we frequently make this mistake that the proletarian is propertyless. Now, proletarian, you have people who lose their property, become paupers, and then only if you get work, then you become a proletarian. So you had the people who were suffering, they were the working classes, they were the paupers, and of course those who were losing their work, the unemployed. Now, we can gauge the economic distress from the fact that the real wages were near subsistence in 1750. For the next 50 years, real wages declined, and there is total agreement among all the economic historians that real wages declined from 1750 to 1850. Now, about the next 2 or 3 decades, what happened there is conflict of opinion. Some would say they declined, some would say they increased, etc. But real wages declining over the major part of the industrial revolution, this is very revealing. So while the few prospered, a lot of the people, the workers, the paupers, those who are losing their jobs, all these people, they suffered greatly as a result of the industrial revolution. Now, apart from the economic loss, there was a social and psychological loss of the working people. First, as I have mentioned previously, there was the feeling of alienation from work. That is, the workers no longer realized their life in their labor. They were no longer planning their activities. They were no longer planning production. They were simply carrying out orders. They were working to the orders of the capitalists and their representatives. So there was a total alienation in the work. Apart from this, they lost the security of the village community. You see, in the cities, yesterday a friend of mine who lives in Delhi in an apartment complex was narrating a rather grotesque incident. They were saying that just across the landing, a person had died and he knew nothing about this. They didn't bother to tell him. The body was moved, he was cremated, and then he was going out to shop, and then the watchman told him, the guard told him that so this happened. And he was saying this is so shocking that this is the urbanization. We all live in our little bubbles. So when we are in the village, there is a community. There were bondages, of course. There was hierarchy, but there was a safety of the community. You would not be allowed to starve. Someone would come in. Nah. But all this was lost. And also, you could talk with your community, you knew. But when you migrated to the towns, your neighbors were unknown to you. And one great index of this is provided by Christopher Hill, I think, or is it Hobson? Christopher. He says that there was a great number of pubs. There was a mushroom growth of pubs during this period of the Industrial Revolution. That is, the workers were trying to sink their miseries in drink. So this was a psychological loss of the Industrial Revolution. So on the one hand, they lost. They were facing economic hardships. On the other hand, they lost the security of their villages, village communities. They lost the security of their families. You see, the families were now, everyone was going out to work, and staying together for a period of time, that was not something which they could now enjoy. And they also lost the security of the parish priest. The priest, in the church has this idea of this practice of confession. You go to the priest, you confess, you say that these are the sins I've committed. He tells you, say so many Ave Marias, or you pay so much, and then you have be expiated from your sins. So this was something basically getting rid of your sins. This is a psychological. This is something like it's a talking cure. Like you talk to your psychoanalyst, you talk to your parish priest. So they were losing all these. The village community, the parish priest, their families, all were being broken up. And together with this, there was the economic hardships they were facing as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Now, The state was an active accomplice in all this. You see, uh, the trade unions were made illegal through the combination laws. And that is the major reason why real wages were falling. Together with this, you had the very harsh poor laws. That is, laws which forbade people to beg. The vagabonds, they were rounded up and put into poor houses. What were these poor houses? These poor houses belonged to each parish. They had their own poor houses where every vagabond, anyone who was begging, would be put into the poor house. And then someone, a capitalist, would take a lease of these poor houses, of poor house, and the people inhabiting the, from children to adults, all those living in that poor house, would then be forced to work for the capitalist. And these were called these were called sweatshops. You have very vivid descriptions of these in Charles Dickens' works. So the state was an active uh, accomplice in this, and there was very high mortality. Children were dying in these poor houses. They were given very little to. You have this. Get the name. You're given one helping. The child is given one helping of food and asks for the second helping, and he is severely beaten up. So there were these instances, and the state, through the poor laws, which were apparently the state claimed that these were in order to help the poor. Instead of begging, they were put into houses where they would be fed. Actually, what this meant was that they would be providing cheap labor to those who leased the labor from the poor houses, from these poor houses. Now, as a result of all this, the working classes, the poor, they were rebelling in various ways. There were various kinds of protest movements. There were the levelers and diggers. The levelers and diggers means that they would take any vacant land and start digging and cultivating. So this was a form of protest. The levelers, of course, believed that you level down the rich. And then there were the Luddites, the machine breakers. You see, Marx was to argue later on that it was the system, the production system, which was the cause of the misery. They realized, but the working classes realized this, but they thought that it was not capitalism. It was the machines which was causing the misery. And so they became machine breakers, the Luddites. And of course, this idea prevailed for a very long time. Workers were very incensed when the conveyor belt system came. Workers were very angry with the machines. And you have a novel by I think Arthur Haley, Wheels, automobile industry, where a worker in an automobile industry commits a crime, goes to prison. When he comes back, he finds the Model T Ford, the first assembly line production, had started, and he was working in an assembly line with a conveyor belt system. And this so angered him that he jams the conveyor belt. So this was what the workers were doing. This was a form of protest. So you had the levelers, the diggers, the Luddites, and machine breakers. And you had also some socialist thinkers. There was Owen, who thought that the cause of misery of the working people was subordination of man to machinery. And he proposed the setting up of communities which would encompass production, distribution, family residence, upbringing of children. This is a utopian kind of idea that you have a sort of Gandhian philosophy where instead of the village, you have, of course, the machines would be there also. Then you had someone called Beguif. He said that nature has given to every man the right to the enjoyment of an equal share in all property. He believed that in order to extract this equal share in all property, there should be violent insurrection and we should claim all nature's property. And then there was another important socialist thinker, Fourier, who had some similarities with Owen's ideas of the community. But Fourier said that men were made different and ultimately we should aspire to a situation where a stage of humanity or complex association, as he calls it, as opposed to a simple association or community that Owen promoted, it should be able to give freedom to everyone to choose whatever they want to do. This was almost like the communist society that Marx is talking about. Now, and after that comes Marx. Now, Marx was the first to realize, to argue that the source of inequity was not in distribution. The source of inequity was not in the unequal distribution of productive resources. The source of inequity was in the exploitation embedded in the production system. That is what he calls, as he says, that Bentham. Equality and Bentham prevailed outside the factory gates. Within the factory gates, there was the master-servant relation. So inequality was built in production. This was something which nobody had argued previously. Secondly, argues that exploitation is caused by dispossession of working class from the means of production, because they have no means of production other than the inalienable right to labor. So, in a market economy, they have to get money to buy their subsistence, and to get that they sell the only thing, the only possession they have, that is their power to labor. So, and this selling, by selling their power to labor, they become bonded within the factory. They become slaves within the factory, and this is the source of exploitation, because they're selling their labor power at its value, which is less than the total labor power that they're selling. That is, they are selling, say, 10 hours of labor power, and the value of that is, say, 6 hours. And so they are producing surplus, which is then appropriated in the form of profit and rent. So Marx is saying that the source of this exploitation is that the dispossession of the working people from the means of production. Thirdly, he constructed, on the basis of this value theory and his theory of class, he constructed a comprehensive theory of capitalism. Not only a static theory, but a dynamic theory of capitalism. Why it should decline, what are the countervailing forces, etc. And as a counterpoint to capitalism, he proposed socialism, where the ownership of means of production would be restored, would be taken away forcibly by the working class. And this, he believed, could be done through insurrection. So this is the, I will end my lecture here today. This is the preliminary, this is the source of Marxism. And from our next lecture, we will start with Marx's philosophical outlook. And so we will start basically from Marxist philosophy in our next class. Today, what we have done is show the times of Marx, what inspired him, both the social times and his personal times. In his personal times, he mentioned that his activism and his familiarity with philosophy, with law, with political economy, and we have traced the social and economic and cultural times, the evolution in a very schematic way. We have talked of the changes in the agricultural sector, the agrarian revolution, and then we have talked of the industrial revolution, urbanization, the loss of the village community, the gained liberties, and therefore liberalism, the optimism which gave birth to the classical political economy and also to liberalism, and the miseries of the poor, which was multiplied, aggravated by the industrial revolution, in fact, which gave rise to socialist ideas of Owen, Fourier, Babeuf, etc. And Marx was actually a descendant of these socialist ideas. He owned these ideas, and he really transformed these ideas, not only because he could criticize these on the basis of their flaws, but because he developed a totally different philosophy, which we will talk about in our next class. So I think because we are quite a few, so if Devashish, if there has been any, I don't know whether questions have come, or should you open it up for questions?
No, actually, there is no make the house open for questions. Uh, it is up.
So, if there are no questions today, I think I will end the lecture at this point.
Foucault's idea of panopticon.
Uh, but I would say it is quite different. You see, panopticon is someone who is surveillance. Panopticon is related to surveillance, uh, uh, control, control of the state. Now, so you have the panopticon, which is actually, it was in fact architectural structure where you are sitting in the middle and you observe everything else. This is the panopticon. It is surveillance to maintain your power. You are looking. The impartial object. I live in, say, a place called Bijoygarh, which is really a lower middle class or working class locality in parts. Now, when I think of buying another air conditioner, I would think how will the people react? So I'm thinking of how others will react to my decision. As an individual, maximizing my own satisfaction, I'll just. I, but impartial observer is I am constructing. I don't know what actually the other person will, what the others will think, but I am constructing an observer who is observing me, who is an average person. Say.
But in a sense, panopticon is also a fixus.
No.
Elim.
Yes.
Not a panopticon.
In what sense?
That is also fixus, no? Or it might be fixus.
It may be. Pardon?
Fixus.
Fictitious, actually.
Fictitious.
It can be fictitious, but here, there I'm not thinking. I'm thinking. You see, this is an ethical question. You see, as far as the impartial observer is concerned, is related to ethics. Whereas the panopticon, I'm afraid, it is like Big Brother watching.
Okay.
So I think the difference lies there. It is surveillance versus ethics. Surveillance for power and ethics.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I think.
In fact, my Kumar's question has led me to put another question. And in case the man who is overlooking in terms of ethical issues, in case he sees that ethics are not being followed, won't he?
Please repeat your question.
In case
that people think of what others are thinking is the impartial observer. I construct in my mind where I'm thinking of the ethics of others. Now, if that ethics, now you see that is, I am thinking. I'm thinking beyond myself. That is all about the impartial observer. So if I'm violating the ethics, then I'm becoming a self-seeking person, like the mainstream presentation. But Smith is arguing against that. So that is it. So it's not.
Any more questions?
Sir, just one observation rather than a question.
Yes, or in the money.
Sir, that you have mentioned the one more sources of Marxism, that apart from Lenin's ideas, that there are three sources of Marxism, that of the English classical, the English political economy, and the French socialism, and the German classical philosophy. So that is one part is added. That is most interesting of it, that the Marxist activism of Marx. That's what you have said, sir. But issues that at the same time, it sounds me that is something like that. What Mao had said, that where correct ideas come from, they come from practice, not from that and the other elements where what should be the priority, and between the theory and practice, where the theory correct ideas or these come from. This sounds this is good. This is what
Yeah,
this is
not,
just simply my why I want to put this is an interesting observation.
this your query, actually we will be discussing this question in detail in our next lecture, where we talk of Marxist philosophy. Says quite clearly that this is borrowed from Mao, Mao on contradictions. So it does come in, but of course we don't have to refer to Mao or to any other successive any Marxist practitioner after Marx. In order to understand Marxist philosophy, we can start directly from what he say, how he's expounding his own philosophy. We'll start with that. We'll read his philosophy, and we read it through the thesis on Feuerbach. And there, I think your question. Yes. So, if there are no other questions, Debashish, will you end the session?
If there are no other questions, I think we would end here today, and we look forward for the next lecture. I think Dipro will be telling us about that, a bit about that, the date and time and etc.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be good, I think. Okay, thank you all for your patience.
Okay, and thank you,
I was,
Prabhupada.
though I was underwhelmed by the number of participants compared to the number of registered.
But I went back to my undergraduate days in the British economic history class.
But next day, I will request a more concentrated listening. I'm hoping, of course, that we were all listening seriously, because next day we'll be going directly into the philosophy of Marx. Okay, thank you all.
Okay. Thank you and good night.